Something has shifted, but it did not announce itself. There was no moment where everything changed, no clear before and after. It happened quietly, almost politely. One day, a decision felt lighter, as if it had already been made somewhere else. Another day, a suggestion arrived before a thought had fully formed. Nothing was taken, nothing was forced. And yet something began to loosen its grip without being noticed. It starts with small things, the kind that do not feel important enough to defend. What time to leave, what to eat, whether to rest now or later. Someone asks, but the question already carries an answer. Someone offers help, and it feels reasonable to accept. There is relief in not having to decide every detail. Relief can feel like kindness. It can feel like care. It can feel like efficiency. And because it feels harmless, it passes through without resistance. You still recognize yourself. You still move through the day. You still hold memories, preferences, opinions. Nothing essential seems gone. But something is thinner. A layer that once sat quietly between thought and action now feels porous. Choices take longer to arrive, or they arrive already shaped by someone else's expectations. You notice it only in fragments, a hesitation that was not there before, a pause that feels unfamiliar. The world around you has not become hostile. In many ways, it has become softer. Voices are gentler. Language is slower. There is more checking in, more concern. That concern does not feel like a threat. It feels considerate. It feels like attention. But attention can change the shape of a moment. It can tilt the balance subtly, the way weight shifts when someone else holds the door open for you and waits, watching. At first, it feels like efficiency. Why struggle with what can be handled easily? Why insist on effort when support is offered? You have earned rest. You have earned ease. These ideas arrive dressed as respect. They sound logical. They feel earned. And so the handoff happens quietly. One decision at a time. No ceremony. No loss large enough to mourn. There is a moment, much later, when you realize you are being asked less often. Not because people are cruel, not because they are dismissive, but because patterns have already formed. The system has learned how to move without you at the center. It still includes you, but differently. You are informed rather than consulted, considered rather than asked. This is not betrayal. It is not conspiracy. It is habit. Habits form fastest when they are comfortable, when nothing pushes back, when silence reads as agreement. And silence often feels easier than explaining yourself. Easier than insisting. Easier than being misunderstood as difficult or ungrateful. You tell yourself it does not matter. And for each individual moment, that is true. None of them matter enough to fight over. None of them feel worth the friction. So you let them go, you conserve energy, you choose peace. These choices feel wise, they feel mature. They feel aligned with experience. But something else is happening alongside that wisdom. A slow recalibration of where authority lives. Not authority in the dramatic sense, not power over others. Authority over direction, over pace, over the internal sense of being the final reference point for your own life. You begin to notice how often decisions are framed for you. How often the range of options is already narrowed. How often language assumes agreement before it is given. Wouldn't it be easier if? It might be better to. We already went ahead and... These phrases are not aggressive. They are smooth. They flow around resistance rather than confronting it. There is a strange feeling that comes with this, not anger, not sadness, more like disorientation, as if the floor has shifted slightly and your body has not recalibrated yet. You are still standing, but your balance is different. You find yourself adjusting without knowing why. You look back and cannot pinpoint when it began. There was no clear starting line, no single decision that opened the door. It was cumulative. 1,000 reasonable moments stacked quietly on top of each other, each one defensible, each one easy to justify. Together they formed a new normal. This new normal does not announce itself as loss. It presents itself as care, as protection, as support. And because it is wrapped in good intentions, it bypasses suspicion. It arrives without resistance because resisting would feel unnecessary, even ungrateful. You tell yourself that autonomy is still there, that you could step back in at any time, that if something truly mattered, you would speak up. And that may still be true. But autonomy is not only about big moments. It is built and maintained through repetition, through the small, unremarkable acts of choosing that remind the nervous system where agency resides. When those acts become infrequent, something subtle changes internally. Decision-making feels heavier. Initiative feels less natural. Not because you are incapable, but because the muscle has been used less often. Muscles weaken quietly, without pain, without warning, until one day you notice the difference. There is also the way people look at you now, not with disrespect, with assessment, with a kind of gentle calibration, as if they are constantly adjusting their expectations. It is not overt. It is felt in the timing of responses, in the way conversations are steered, in how conclusions are drawn slightly ahead of you. You notice how explanations become longer, how reassurance appears before concern has been expressed, how options are framed as recommendations rather than possibilities. None of this feels like an attack. It feels like management, and management rarely feels hostile. It feels organized, efficient, clean. Part of you understands why. You understand risk. You understand caution. You understand how the world sees age. You have seen the stories. You have absorbed the narratives. Even when you do not agree with them, they live in the background. They shape expectations without asking permission. You are not resisting reality. You are not denying change. You are aware of limits, of energy, of time. This awareness is not the problem. The problem is how easily awareness is translated into assumption by others. How quickly understanding becomes justification for taking over. You begin to sense that the shift is not only external, it is internal. There is a part of you that has begun to step back voluntarily, a part that chooses convenience over assertion, harmony over friction. This part is not weak. It is tired. It is strategic. It is choosing its battles. But every strategy has a cost. And the cost of choosing silence too often is that silence starts to speak for you. It becomes your representative. Others learn to listen to it instead of waiting for your voice. There is a quiet grief in this realization, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a low, steady awareness that something personal has been diluted. Not stolen, diluted, spread thin across systems, routines, well-meaning hands. You still function, you still contribute, you still matter, but the center feels less solid, as if the axis around which things once turned has shifted slightly off course. You do not announce this feeling. There is no language for it that feels appropriate. Complaining would feel exaggerated. Explaining would feel defensive, so you keep it to yourself. It becomes an internal observation, a private noticing. This noticing is uncomfortable because it raises questions that do not have easy answers. At what point does help stop being help? At what point does adaptation become surrender? At what point does choosing peace cost more than it saves? You are not looking for control over others. You are not looking to prove anything. You are not looking to reclaim some imagined past. You are looking for something quieter. The sense that your inner position has not been relocated without your consent. This is where awareness begins, not with outrage, not with resolve, with noticing, with the subtle recognition that autonomy does not disappear in a single moment. It erodes through convenience, through kindness, through silence. You sit with this realization. You do not rush to fix it. You do not dramatize it. You let it exist. Because awareness, when it is honest, does not demand immediate action. It demands clarity. And clarity begins with seeing what has been happening without needing to assign blame, without turning it into a story of villains and victims, just seeing the mechanics, the patterns, the quiet exchange where choice slowly migrates away from the center. You are still here, still thinking, still noticing. That matters. Because the shift may have begun quietly, but awareness begins the same way. And awareness, when it is internal and unannounced, changes the direction of things long before anyone else can see it. Once awareness settles, patterns begin to reveal themselves without effort. They were always there, but now they align into something coherent. What once felt like isolated moments starts to feel connected. The same tone repeats, the same sequence, help offered before it is requested, decisions framed as conclusions, questions shaped so narrowly that the answer is already implied. It becomes clear that this is not coincidence, it is structure. You notice how easily concern turns into direction, How often the language of care carries an invisible lever. It starts with phrases that sound reasonable. We just want to make things easier. We thought this would be better for you. It seemed unnecessary to bother you with details. Each sentence arrives calm, measured, thoughtful. None of them sound like commands, none of them feel hostile. And yet each one nudges the center of gravity slightly away from you. At first it feels cooperative, like teamwork, like shared responsibility. You tell yourself this is what maturity looks like, allowing others to step in. Trusting systems, letting go of the need to oversee everything. This interpretation feels generous. It feels evolved. It also feels safe. But safety has its own momentum. Once it becomes the dominant value, other values quietly move aside. You begin to recognize how often your agreement is assumed rather than requested. How often plans are presented as updates instead of invitations. Someone explains what will happen, not what could happen. You are not excluded, you are included after the fact. Inclusion without influence. Presence without authority. There is a subtle shift in how time is treated. Decisions are made quickly, often justified by urgency. We needed to move fast. There was no time to check. Speed becomes the excuse. Efficiency becomes the virtue. And efficiency rarely waits for reflection. It rewards momentum, not deliberation. You notice how often others speak on your behalf, not out of arrogance, out of habit. They anticipate your needs. They interpret your preferences. They translate your silence into consent. This interpretation is rarely malicious. It is practical. It keeps things moving. But movement without pause leaves little room for agency to reassert itself. The patterns extend beyond individuals. They live in routines, in systems designed to minimize friction, forms that limit options, processes that default to the simplest path. You are guided gently through predetermined steps. The structure is polite. It does not force, it funnels. You begin to see how language itself plays a role. Words soften edges while carrying weight. Just to be safe, probably best, might as well. These phrases lower resistance, they make compliance feel reasonable. They transform choice into inevitability. There is also the way your own responses have changed. You notice how often you nod without fully considering, how often you say fine to avoid slowing things down, how often you accept explanations instead of asking questions. Not because you do not care, but because caring feels tiring, because pushing back feels disproportionate to the outcome. This is where recognition deepens. It is not only about what others are doing, it is about how easily the arrangement becomes mutual, how the system relies on your cooperation, how autonomy erodes not through force, but through agreement. You begin to understand that help has a structure. It is not neutral. It carries assumptions about capability, about risk, about responsibility. When someone helps, they also position themselves. They become the actor. You become the recipient. That dynamic has gravity. Over time, it pulls roles into place. The more help is accepted without question, the more it becomes expected. The expectation changes how people approach you. They arrive prepared to assist rather than to ask. They come with solutions rather than curiosity. They step into gaps before you have the chance to fill them yourself. You see how this pattern is reinforced by praise, how compliance is rewarded with approval, how ease is celebrated. You are thanked for being flexible, for being agreeable, for not making things complicated. These compliments feel good, they affirm your character. They also reinforce behavior that slowly sidelines your authority. There is a quiet discomfort in realizing how little resistance there has been, how rarely you have asserted preference when it would have been possible, how often you chose not to because the stakes felt small. But small stakes repeated over time create large consequences. You begin to recognize the moment when concern crosses into control. It is rarely dramatic. It happens when decisions are justified by what is best for you without your participation, when outcomes are prioritized over consent, when risk avoidance becomes the dominant narrative. You notice how often age is referenced indirectly, not as accusation, as context, at your stage, given everything. These phrases frame decisions without explicitly stating limitations. They sound factual, neutral, but they shape expectations. They define the perimeter within which choices are considered acceptable. You realize how quickly people move from asking how you feel to deciding what you need. The transition is smooth, almost seamless. One moment you are being heard. The next, your experience is translated into action by someone else. The translation may be accurate. It may even be helpful, but it removes you from the center of the process. There is also the role of anticipation. People act before problems arise, before discomfort is expressed. They preemptively remove obstacles. This anticipation feels thoughtful. It is also prescriptive. It assumes outcomes. It narrows futures. You begin to see how systems prefer predictability over autonomy. Predictable people are easier to manage, easier to plan around, easier to protect. Autonomy introduces variables. Variables slow things down. They complicate processes. They require patience. You recognize how often your independence is reframed as inconvenience, not explicitly, subtly, as something that needs to be accommodated rather than respected. The framing is gentle, but it positions your choices as disruptions rather than expressions. There is a moment when you realize that being easy to help is not the same as being respected. That cooperation can coexist with diminishment. That harmony can mask imbalance. You notice how often decisions are explained after they are made. The explanation is thorough, logical, calm, it makes sense. And because it makes sense, it feels difficult to challenge. Challenging it would require energy. It would require justification. It would require making a case for your own authority. You recognize how often your past competence is acknowledged while your present agency is bypassed. People reference what you used to do, how capable you were, how independent you have always been. These acknowledgements sound respectful. They also locate your authority in the past rather than the present. You begin to understand that recognition itself can be a form of control. When people recognize your limitations more readily than your preferences, when they prioritize safety over self-determination, when they frame their actions as protection rather than partnership, you see how easily the narrative shifts from helping you live your life to managing your life. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Management implies oversight. It implies responsibility for outcomes. It implies authority. You realize that once someone feels responsible for your outcomes, they feel entitled to your decisions, not out of ego, out of logic. Responsibility demands control. Control requires authority. Authority displaces autonomy. This recognition does not arrive with anger. It arrives with clarity, a calm, almost clinical understanding of the mechanics at play. You see how the pieces fit together, how good intentions align with efficient systems to produce quiet displacement. You notice how rarely anyone asks what you want without filtering it through feasibility, without translating it into what makes sense. Desire is often the first thing to be negotiated away. Practicality replaces preference. You recognize how easily you have adapted to this arrangement, how often you have internalized the logic, how often you have preemptively adjusted your own desires to align with what is expected. This adaptation feels mature. It feels realistic. It also feels constraining. You see how autonomy does not vanish. It is relocated. It moves from being exercised openly to being negotiated internally. You weigh options not based on what you want, but on what will be easiest for everyone else. You consider impact before desire. You calculate inconvenience before inclination. This internal shift is the most significant pattern of all, because it happens quietly, without witnesses, without commentary. It feels like responsibility, it feels like consideration, it feels like wisdom. Recognition settles deeper now. You see that help is not inherently problematic, but unexamined help carries momentum. It moves in one direction unless something counters it, and that counterforce is awareness. You are not looking to reverse everything. You are not looking to reject support. You are looking to understand the trade-offs, to see where consent has been replaced by assumption, where collaboration has turned into delegation. This understanding does not demand immediate correction, it demands presence. The kind of presence that notices when a choice is being framed for you, when a decision is being made on your behalf, when your silence is being interpreted as agreement. Recognition is quiet, It does not announce itself. It simply changes how you see what is happening. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The patterns remain visible, the mechanics exposed. You understand now that autonomy is not lost through dramatic acts. It is negotiated away through convenience, through kindness, through efficiency, through your own willingness to make things easier for others. This recognition is not empowering in a celebratory sense, it is sobering. It strips away comforting narratives. It reveals the cost of ease, the price of being managed gently rather than consulted directly. You sit with this clarity, not to judge, not to react, but to understand the terrain. Because understanding precedes choice, and choice, even when unspoken, begins internally. The patterns are clear now. Help becomes control when it no longer asks. Concern becomes authority when it no longer listens. And recognition, once it arrives, quietly reclaims ground long before anything else changes. There is a weight that settles in once recognition turns inward. It is not sharp. It does not announce itself as pain. It is heavier than sadness and quieter than anger. It feels like being repositioned without being moved, like standing in the same place while the room rearranges itself around you. Loss does not arrive as disappearance. It arrives as substitution. You are still present, but you are handled differently. The tone shifts first. Voices soften in a way that does not feel intimate. It feels careful, as if words are being selected to avoid something unnamed. Sentences stretch longer, filled with reassurance you did not ask for. You are told things will be fine before you have expressed concern. You notice how people wait less. They fill pauses quickly. Silence no longer belongs to you. It is treated as uncertainty rather than contemplation. Someone steps in to help the moment a gap appears. The space where your decision might have formed is occupied before it fully exists. Being spoken to differently is not immediately insulting. It is subtle. It is measured. But it carries a shift in assumption. Explanations become more detailed. Confirmations more frequent. The underlying message is not that you are incapable, but that your margin for error is assumed to be smaller. There is a strange intimacy in being managed. It feels attentive. It feels involved. It also feels enclosing, like hands that guide you forward without asking which direction you intended to go. The guidance is gentle, the pressure minimal, and because it is minimal, it is easy to accept. You begin to sense that your role has changed. You are no longer the one who decides and then informs. You are the one who is informed and then decides whether to object. This reversal is quiet. It happens without negotiation. It is justified by efficiency, by concern, by practicality. Loss reveals itself in how conversations end. Decisions are summarized rather than debated. Outcomes are confirmed rather than explored. You are thanked for understanding. Gratitude replaces consent. Once thanked, it feels awkward to reopen the discussion. The moment has passed. The conclusion has settled. You notice how your preferences are remembered selectively. The parts that align with convenience are honored. The parts that require adjustment are softened, delayed, or reframed. Over time, you learn which desires are welcomed and which are treated as complications. You adjust accordingly. This adjustment is internal. No one asks you to do it. You do it because you sense the friction otherwise. You feel the subtle tightening when you push back, the pause, the recalculation, the shift in energy. It is not hostility. It is inconvenience. Being managed instead of consulted creates a particular kind of loneliness. You are surrounded by people, yet the core of you feels less addressed. You are included in the outcome but excluded from the process. The process is where dignity lives. You feel it when plans are discussed around you instead of with you, when your name is used as a reference point rather than a voice, when others speak about what you need as if you are not fully present. They do not mean to exclude you. They assume alignment. There is a moment when you realize that questions have become rhetorical. They are asked to confirm what has already been decided. Do you mind if? Would it be okay if? The phrasing suggests choice, but the structure suggests expectation. Declining would require justification. Agreement requires nothing. Loss deepens when you begin to censor yourself, when you preemptively simplify your desires to avoid negotiation, when you choose not to express preferences that would disrupt the flow. This self-censorship feels reasonable. It feels considerate. It also feels like disappearance in slow motion. You notice how often others check in with each other about you, how decisions involving you are discussed elsewhere. This is done out of care, out of caution, out of a desire to protect. But protection has a cost. It relocates agency. You feel the emotional weight of being anticipated, of having your needs guessed before you articulate them. When anticipation is accurate, it feels supportive. When it is not, it still overrides your voice. Correcting it feels petty. So you accept the mismatch. There is a quiet humiliation in being over-explained, in having your understanding underestimated, not openly, not rudely, just enough to remind you that you are no longer assumed to be the primary authority on your own experience. You notice how often safety is invoked. Safety becomes the trump card. It ends discussions. It justifies decisions. It cannot be argued against without appearing reckless. And so it becomes the final word. Loss is also temporal. It affects how your time is treated. Your schedule becomes flexible in a way that benefits others more than you. Appointments are moved. Plans are adjusted. You are expected to accommodate because you are perceived as having fewer constraints. You feel it when people speak about your future with certainty, when options are narrowed in advance, when long-term plans are framed around maintenance rather than expansion. Growth becomes impractical. Stability becomes the goal. There is grief in realizing that your complexity is being reduced, not erased, simplified. Your identity is distilled into manageable categories, capable enough, independent enough, but within limits that others define. You notice how often your resilience is acknowledged while your autonomy is quietly bypassed. Compliments about strength coexist with decisions that assume fragility. The contradiction is rarely addressed. Being managed carries an emotional toll because it alters how you see yourself. You begin to doubt your own impulses. You second-guess decisions before making them. You internalize the caution that surrounds you. Risk begins to feel irresponsible. This internalization is perhaps the deepest loss, because it happens without external enforcement. You adopt the logic that limits you. You begin to self-regulate in anticipation of others' concerns. You choose restraint before it is requested. You feel the shift in your body, in how you move through spaces. You become more deliberate, more careful, not out of fear, but out of awareness of being observed. Observation changes behavior, even gentle observation. Loss appears in the way conversations about you are framed as planning rather than possibility, in how your life is discussed as something to be organized rather than lived. The language is subtle, the effect cumulative. You realize that dignity fades before strength, long before capability is lost. Authority is reassigned. You are still strong, still sharp, still capable, but the assumption has shifted. Others now hold the steering wheel, even if loosely. There is sadness in recognizing how easily this happened, how little resistance there was, how much of it felt like kindness. You are not angry at anyone. You understand their perspective. You might do the same in their place. But understanding does not negate loss. It clarifies it. You feel it most acutely in moments of decision. When you hesitate not because you are unsure, but because you are calculating reaction. When you weigh not only outcomes, but approval. When you choose the path that will generate the least discussion. Loss is cumulative. It does not overwhelm. It accumulates. Each small surrender adds weight. Over time, the weight becomes noticeable. You feel tired in a way that rest does not resolve, because the fatigue is not physical, it is positional. You have been moved from the center to the perimeter of your own life without being pushed. You stepped aside gradually, and now you notice the distance. There is no single person to blame, no moment to confront, no injustice dramatic enough to protest. That is what makes the loss so difficult to address. It is diffuse. It is embedded in routine. It is reinforced by good intentions. You grieve quietly, not for what is gone, but for what is slipping, for the part of you that once moved without negotiation, that decided without explanation, that acted without being monitored. This grief is private. You do not share it. It would sound exaggerated, it would sound ungrateful. So you carry it internally. It becomes part of your inner landscape. Loss also changes how you are mirrored back to yourself. When others see you as someone to be managed, you begin to see yourself through that lens. Not fully, not completely, but enough to influence behavior. You notice how your confidence has become conditional, how certainty now requires validation, how you look outward before trusting inward. This is not because you lack judgment. It is because judgment has been outsourced gradually. The emotional weight of this realization is heavy but clarifying. It strips away illusions about how autonomy is lost. It is not taken. It is reassigned through patterns that feel reasonable at every step. You sit with this loss without dramatizing it, without rushing to reclaim anything. You let yourself feel the discomfort, the sadness, the quiet anger that never quite forms into words. Because naming the loss internally is part of restoring balance. Even if nothing changes outwardly yet, something shifts when you acknowledge what has been happening. You understand now that being managed is not the same as being cared for. That dignity requires participation, not just protection. That autonomy erodes when your voice is replaced by assumptions. This understanding does not immediately restore what has been lost, but it stabilizes something inside. It anchors you again in awareness. Loss has been recognized, not denied, not dramatized, just seen. And in that seeing, something begins to settle, not resolution, not relief, but readiness. The weight remains. But it is no longer confusing. It has shape now, meaning, and meaning, even when heavy, changes how you carry what remains. Clarity does not arrive with relief. It arrives with stillness. A quiet recalibration that happens beneath language, beneath reaction. Nothing is reclaimed outwardly. Nothing is announced. The shift is internal, almost imperceptible, but firm. It is the recognition of where autonomy actually lives and where it never truly left. You begin to see that what was taken was never the core. It was the surface expression, the visible acts, the logistical authority. Those can be reassigned, shared, even surrendered without destroying the center. What matters is not who executes the decision, but where the decision is owned. This understanding settles slowly. It strips away the false urgency to fight, to correct, to prove. You realize that confrontation would only reinforce the external frame. It would confirm that authority exists out there, something to be negotiated or contested. That is not where it belongs. Autonomy is not the ability to do everything yourself. It is the ability to remain internally sovereign even when others participate, even when roles change, even when assistance is necessary. The mistake was never accepting help. The mistake was allowing help to relocate authorship. Clarity reveals that dignity is not maintained by control, but by internal position, by knowing without explanation that you are the final reference point for meaning, that no one else interprets your life for you unless you invite them to. You begin to notice the difference between action and consent, between participation and surrender. You see how often you allowed decisions to pass not because you agreed, but because you disengaged. Disengagement felt like peace, but peace without presence creates vacancy. Clarity restores presence. You realize that autonomy does not require resistance. Resistance keeps you reactive. It ties your sense of self to opposition. Autonomy is quieter. It does not argue. It does not justify. It does not need to be seen. It exists in the moment you notice a decision being framed for you and internally acknowledge whether it aligns or not. Even if you allow it to proceed, the internal acknowledgement matters. It preserves authorship. You see now that being consulted is not the same as being sovereign. Consultation is external. Sovereignty is internal. You can be consulted and still be displaced. You can be bypassed and still remain intact if you do not internalize the bypass. Clarity separates behavior from identity. Others may organize, manage, anticipate. That is their domain. What matters is whether you mistake their actions for definitions of you. You stop measuring autonomy by how much you do. You measure it by whether your inner posture has shifted, whether you have begun to see yourself as someone to be handled rather than someone who chooses. This is where clarity sharpens. You notice that even when choices are limited, interpretation remains free. Meaning remains yours. No one can decide what an event signifies unless you outsource that too. You begin to feel less urgency to correct perceptions, to remind others of who you are, Reminding them implies dependence on their recognition. Clarity dissolves that need. You understand now that autonomy is not maintained by insisting on independence, but by refusing internal abdication. You can accept support without becoming secondary to it. You can cooperate without dissolving. You see how much energy was spent reacting to the feeling of loss. That energy quiets now, not because the loss was imagined, but because you understand its boundaries. What was lost was not agency itself, but the habit of exercising it consciously. Habits can be re-established internally without external disruption. Clarity brings precision. You become aware of the moment you are tempted to withdraw, to nod, to disengage, and in that moment you do not necessarily act differently. You simply remain present. Presence is enough. You stop interpreting silence as weakness. Silence can be chosen. Chosen silence preserves power. Unconscious silence relinquishes it. The difference is internal, not visible. You understand now that no one can fully take your autonomy unless you internalize their authority. Authority begins where belief settles. If belief remains yours, control remains limited. Clarity removes the illusion that autonomy must look a certain way, that it must be loud, active, visible. Those are external performances. True autonomy is not performed, it is held. You no longer confuse being managed with being diminished. Management is a role others adopt. Diminishment only occurs if you adopt it too. This understanding brings a subtle calm, not comfort. Calm. The kind that does not seek reassurance, the kind that does not need validation. You see now that dignity is preserved through internal alignment, when your actions, even constrained ones, are consciously chosen rather than passively accepted. Clarity also reveals choice where you thought there was none. Not choice of outcome, but choice of stance. You may not choose the structure, but you choose how you inhabit it. You begin to recognize that autonomy does not disappear with age. It is tested, pressured, negotiated, but it remains intact unless surrendered internally. This realization shifts how you experience help. Help no longer feels like encroachment. It feels like collaboration when you remain internally present. It feels like interference only when you disengage. Clarity teaches you that you do not need to reclaim everything. You only need to stop abandoning yourself in small moments. You feel steadier now. Not because circumstances have changed, but because your internal reference point has returned to its place. You no longer scan interactions for evidence of loss. You scan yourself for presence. This is not optimism, it is realism refined, a sober understanding of where control actually lives. Clarity does not restore what was lost externally. It restores something more durable. The quiet knowledge that whatever arrangements exist around you, authorship remains intact as long as you remain internally awake. And that awareness, once re-established, does not require defense. It simply is. Quiet autonomy does not announce itself. It does not correct anyone. It does not seek permission to exist. It settles inwardly, like weight redistributing itself until balance returns. Nothing changes on the surface at first. Conversations sound the same. Offers of help still arrive. Structures remain in place. But something fundamental has shifted in how you occupy yourself within them. You no longer feel the need to clarify who you are. Clarification implies misunderstanding that must be repaired. Quiet autonomy accepts misunderstanding without internal collapse. Others may see you through their frameworks. You do not rush to adjust them. Their perception no longer defines your position. There is a noticeable absence of urgency now. Decisions do not press against you the way they once did. When a plan is presented, you feel the pause inside before agreement or refusal. That pause belongs to you, even if you choose to accept what is proposed. The choice is conscious. It is owned. Ownership changes the texture of compliance. You stop rehearsing explanations. You stop anticipating objections. Those habits belong to a time when authority felt external. Quiet autonomy dissolves the need to justify internal alignment. You do not argue with systems. You simply remain intact within them. You notice how your posture has changed, not physically, internally. There is less leaning outward, less scanning for cues, less waiting for signals about what is appropriate. You respond rather than adapt. Even when responses are minimal, they are deliberate. Silence becomes precise. You no longer use it to disappear. You use it to remain present without engagement. This kind of silence is not passive. It is selective. It carries awareness. When help is offered, you no longer feel the reflexive pull to accept or reject. You assess quietly. Does this support my authorship or replace it? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is no. The difference is that the decision is internal first, not negotiated externally. You do not announce boundaries, you embody them. Boundaries spoken aloud invite negotiation. Boundaries lived quietly are rarely challenged. People adjust without comment when the internal position is steady. You begin to see that dignity is not restored by reclaiming tasks or responsibilities. It is restored by reclaiming orientation, by deciding, moment to moment, whether you are acting from presence or from accommodation. Quiet autonomy expresses itself in restraint. You do not correct every assumption. You do not reclaim every role. You let some things pass because passing is chosen, not imposed. There is a particular calm in no longer needing to be central to every process. Centrality is not the same as sovereignty. You can be peripheral in logistics while remaining central in meaning. You notice how often people still assume things. That does not change. What changes is your relationship to those assumptions. They no longer penetrate. They hover at the surface. You feel less reactive, not because you care less, but because your sense of self is no longer tied to how much influence you visibly exert. Influence becomes internal. It shapes how you interpret, how you respond, how you move on. You do not attempt to reverse time. You do not try to restore an earlier version of yourself. That version belonged to a different context. Quiet autonomy does not cling. It adapts without self-erasure. You understand now that autonomy after 60 looks different. It is not expansive. It is concentrated. It does not spread outward. It deepens inward. You no longer confuse being overlooked with being erased. You are not erased unless you abandon your own reference point. As long as you remain internally aligned, visibility becomes optional. There is also a subtle confidence in no longer needing outcomes to validate choice. Even when decisions lead to compromise, the compromise is conscious. That consciousness preserves dignity. Quiet autonomy does not seek to educate others. Education implies responsibility for their understanding. You release that responsibility. Others may or may not see you clearly. That is no longer the measure. You notice how your energy returns, not as excitement, as steadiness. The fatigue that came from constant adaptation eases. You are no longer bracing yourself against displacement. You are settled. You do not romanticize independence. You accept interdependence without internal collapse. Assistance flows in and out without redefining you. When you are not asked, you do not internalize exclusion. When you are informed rather than consulted, you note it without absorbing it. Your sense of authorship does not depend on procedure. Quiet autonomy also means refusing certain roles without explanation. You decline internally first. Sometimes that internal refusal never needs to be spoken. Behavior adjusts naturally. You realize that the most powerful refusals are invisible. They happen at the level of identification. You stop identifying with the role others assign. The role loses weight. You feel less need to prepare for the future defensively. You are no longer organizing your life around avoiding loss of control. You are grounded in the understanding that control was never the foundation, presence was. Quiet autonomy is not withdrawal. It is selectivity. You choose where to engage, where to invest, where to let things proceed without you. You notice that your thoughts are your own again, not shaped by anticipation of reaction, not filtered through external comfort. They move freely, even when unspoken. You do not rush transformation. There is no finish line. Quiet autonomy is not an achievement. It is a posture. It remains even when circumstances tighten, even when options narrow, even when others step closer, as long as you do not step away from yourself. You understand now that autonomy is not something others grant or remove. It is something you either inhabit or vacate, quietly. Without declaration, without resistance, without noise, you remain, and that is enough.